At the top, all of this concern about China. This is spooking the markets a little bit today. Joe's right. It's a decline of under 2% for the Dow, but still down 460 points is a number that catches your attention. And when you look at China's markets, down 5.5% and down 7%. That is certainly something that is catching their attention today, too. I can't think of three better people to talk about this morning. Bill, you've spent so much time going back and forth with China. You know the Chinese leadership very well and can understand maybe what they're thinking on some of these things. Charlie, you've spent so much time getting excited about investing there. And Bill, you've invested there as well. Warren, same thing. All three of you have traveled there and spent this time. I just wonder what you're thinking about this morning as you hear these headlines. And Bill, you're the new one at the table today. So I'll ask you to start off with this. What are your thoughts on what you hear with this tweet and the potential for a real trade war?
Well, I think good trade relations are an incredible win-win for both countries. And it's dangerous if people think this is a zero-sum game. And so I'm hopeful that despite the latest announcement, there is a trade agreement and the two countries can find ways to work together. It's the most important relationship in the world. Both sides bring a lot of strengths. So I understand why markets are a little bit worried that these tariffs are going to get higher and higher.
When we first got the tweet, there had been some initial reports that Li Hu and the delegation from China might not be coming here. That's what we were hearing last night. This is the first I've heard just a moment ago that the Chinese have confirmed that they will be sending that delegation this week. That in itself is good news. But how do the Chinese kind of deal with this when they're faced with real force, like I think that tweet yesterday was?
Well, I'm not an expert on negotiation, but it creates a dynamic where both sides could start escalating against each other, which would be a lose for both sides. So, this week it'll be interesting. Even though China's not a democracy, the political dynamics don't allow them to look like they're caving in to a unilateral position.
And Charlie, you are an expert in negotiation. What do you think?
Well, hardly, but, if you go back, we put a tariff on trucks to prevent the Japanese from totally squelching the whole American auto industry. And that lasted a long time. It wasn't the end of the world. So if we end up with some trade settlement that involves some tariffs on both sides, I don't get excited about it at all. I regard it as part of normal life. Generally speaking, I think a good settlement is better than a lovely world war.
Some tariffs are one thing. 10%, we seem like our economy has gone along just fine, even with the 10% tariff that existed on those $200 billion to date. Is 25% tariffs on potentially all 500 billion plus of the imports coming in. Would that concern you about the American economy?
Well, I don't think we want a full-scale tariff war that's just as high as both sides can make it. That would be massively stupid. And if both of them are a little disappointed with the negotiations and feel a little roughed up, that's what they should feel.
What do you mean they should feel roughed up?
Well, both sides, since a settlement is so much better than a trade war for both sides, they ought to just get used to having a little loss of face and make some kind of a settlement. And I think they will.
What do you think about us taking a stance, us being America, taking a stance with China to this point?
Well, I don't think Trump is totally crazy to say that on some occasions you put a tariff on to save some domestic industry.
Is he right that we have been on the losing side of the deal for some time? There's a lot of Americans who feel that.
I think he thinks of it more as a loss if we've got a trade deficit. And I don't think that's at all automatic. So I don't totally agree with him, but I agree with Trump in part.
Warren, what do you think in terms of who pays the tariffs? I mean, it has boosted the U.S. Treasury. but a lot of those tariffs are being paid by the companies that import the goods and then passed on to consumers.
Yeah, they're a tax on consumers, and as such, that it changes what people buy. It changes where things are produced. I mean, you can readjust the world through tariffs, and generally speaking, I mean, there's obvious exceptions for key equipment, military equipment, but I generally think that a world that adjusts to something very close to free trade, more people will live better than in a world with significant tariffs and shifting tariffs over time. I mean, it was a subject of constant negotiation and that sort of thing.
Probably a less chance in war, too, if there's heavy trade on both sides.
Yeah.
Not a trade war. You mean a real
Yeah,
war?
real war, yes.
Because
But you got to remember that our country, the United States, ran on tariffs for the first 150 years. That was all the revenue we had. This is not like some novel new thing is coming in. This is an old subject.
is it a good thing or a bad thing?
Well, of course, I'd rather have total goodwill and everybody getting along. But I don't think it's the end of the world. There's some little tension on the subject. There has been since the start of the country.
Bill just now said he's not surprised by the market's reaction. Warren said the same thing earlier this morning. What about you?
Well, what do I care about a brief, temporary reaction over some uproar over trade negotiations?
Does that mean...
There are all so many little rebels in space-time to me.
Look, if you look at Chinese stocks in one market down 5.5% and the other in the Shenzhen market down by over 7%, our futures are down, but that's still a decline of less than 2% this morning. Does that mean it's more painful to China than to us?
Well, I don't think China likes its market going down as a consequence of a trade uproar. I think the people are more like this, settle a thing because they had this uproar today.
Settling sounds like a great alternative, but
It certainly does.
There have been a lot of friction along the way. The biggest one may be just how do you enforce it? And the feeling, at least among many of the trade negotiators in the United States, that when we've cut deals with China in the past, they say things and then don't follow through on it. How do you make sure that if we have a deal, it's actually enforceable?
I think China, by and large, is a pretty good place. It certainly worked well for the Chinese, and I think it's desirable that it works well.
We want China to prosper.
Yeah, we do.
If you postulate a world where in the next 50 years, the China, or for that matter, the United States, but feel like they're being abused and the word isn't being kept, and you ask for one thing and then you want to ask for one thing more. I mean, you're going to always have tension between the two countries. You'll always have disagreements, but you can't really turn it where it gets into something where it gets out of control, and things can't get out of control.
But I guess I'm going back to try and figure out which side you think is right. Nobody wants to say that. Does anybody have a feeling?
Well, I think they're both right to be as concerned as they are, and I predict they'll settle it.
Would you all agree with that same prediction? Bill, what do you think?
It's a dilemma when it appears you're reacting to an ultimatum. In the Chinese case, there's no elections scheduled, so their leader won't be unelected simply because they've had to take a tough stance on trade negotiations. Markets up until recently were assuming this deal would get closed.
Right.
So that's a little bit why you see the delta. The rational thing would be for a deal to get closed, and I'd still rate that as likely.
I agree with Bill.
Deadlines are tricky things, though. I mean,
Yeah.
they produce reactions in people, and they can particularly if you're responding to public opinion, they can inflame people, and then they start reacting to their own. They're tricky things. On the other hand, sometimes it's the best way to get things done.
A good sign, though, maybe that they just said that the Chinese delegation will continue to come, because I had real questions about that, or doubts about that myself after seeing that yesterday.
You want to conduct negotiations so it doesn't look like the other guy has to cave or something like
Right.
that. The ideal thing is to make a hero out of them and still get the deal you want.
Over the weekend at the annual meeting, you two had an aside on stage that a lot of people kind of picked up on. You didn't follow up on it, so I thought we could do that here. You were talking about Dairy Queen and how your presence in China is not large, but you do have a presence in China.
Yeah,
For
we're
Dairy-
all over China.
For Dairy Queen, it is a very large presence, but not for Berkshire Hathaway.
No.
But you made the comment, Warren, that you would have been a much larger presence had a big deal gone through. You made it in as a aside to Charlie, but
Yeah.
it was over the mics.
Well, we've looked at bigger. It didn't have anything to do with Dairy Queen.
No. I figured not.
We are not turning Dairy Queen into some global giant. Or yeah, we've looked at good-sized things in China, and we've done a couple things in China. And Charlie's done more individually, and it's logical. I mean, with the kind of capital we have, the big markets outside the United States are going to be the place where you're most likely to do something, and certainly China's going to be the biggest market and outside the United States, and there should be opportunities there. And I think we are someone at Berkshire, I think that if they're looking for capital around the world, we're a very logical prospect.
Why did that deal not work out? Was it because of the trade tensions?
I can't go into any details on that.
Thought I'd try.
You'll be the first to know.
In terms of what you do with your businesses, do these trade talks have any impact on you, on your investments, even your own personal ones, because you all have a large individual portfolio that you do. And Charlie, I know you focus a lot.
Some are larger than others.
Well, Charlie, I know you focused a lot on China. Does this diminish your enthusiasm for Chinese investments in any way?
No.
No, it doesn't really. If we got a call today from some business we understood and liked from China, and they were looking for a lot of, it was big, we would be delighted to get that call. Mm-hmm. And we would follow through and we'd see whether something happened. But that would be very interesting to us.
Bill, how about you?
Well, certainly, there is, in parallel with the trade talks about what the technology export regime will look like in terms of things like artificial intelligence.
Right.
And so I have some concerns about whether that will try and partition, Chinese students from American students. The general sentiment towards China right now has gone down a bit. And so there are businesses or business deals that have to go through a new process, and they're talking about even making that tighter.
CBS or beyond?
So I'm worried about even the sort of intellectual cooperation being slowed down. We'll see where that goes, but it's a concern.
If they take our intellectual property at Dairy Queen, we can handle it.
We've talked an awful lot on our air recently about socialism versus capitalism, defending capitalism, all of the different political pressures that are kind of being brought as we get into another election year. And I thought maybe we could talk about that this morning, too. Over the weekend, several questions came up about defending capitalism. And Warren, you did step out and say that you're a card-carrying member, a card-carrying capitalist in front of everyone. What do you think about the attacks that we've seen to this point on capitalism?
Well, I don't think people exactly even know what they're talking about. It isn't that capitalism is perfect, but if you look at what was here in 1776 and look at what is here now, this country has done an incredible job in terms of the deployment of resources and human ingenuity. And that is a product of the system. Now, does that mean that every decision should be made simply by open market determinants? No, there's a need for regulation, obviously, and there are things that have long-term costs and might not get built in. But the idea of people unleashing their potential, using the resources they have to create what we have now from what was here 240-some years ago, it's absolutely a miracle, and what all three of us have seen during our lifetime. And if you compare that with any centralized, planned economy, I think we win hands down. And I think we've just started with what capitalism can produce in the United States. But I do think it obviously it needs certain rules and regulations.
Bill, you did an interview in Davos with someone, and you made a pretty innocuous statement that you looked around, you thought capitalism was the best system, and you got attacked online from all these people who came up with these crazy statements about how could you say things like that. I mean, what do you think about the climate when you see things like that?
Well, some people think when you defend capitalism, you're defending the tax rates we have today and saying that higher absolute tax rates or more progressive tax rates, that you're disagreeing with them. And I don't think Warren and I are disagreeing that you could make the taxes more progressive. In fact, we've been very explicit in some areas, like the estate tax, and saying we think that would be a good thing. Socialism...
You got your wish, it came back.
Socialism used to mean that the state controlled the means of production. And a lot of people who are promoting socialism actually aren't using that classic definition. So what we're going to have is capitalism with some level of taxation. Most people really aren't arguing against capitalism. There may be a few, but most people are just saying that the taxes should change.
Although you do have someone who I think is polling the second highest in the Democratic Party right now, who was a socialist until very recently, Bernie Sanders.
Well, whether or not he was a socialist by the full term of that, now there is some muddy areas. When you start to say there shouldn't be any billionaires, that you have some cap on wealth or something like that, that goes beyond what I think, and you could say I'm self-interested, but...
Really?
We will exempt the present ones. But government needs to reallocate some resources. I mean, extreme case would be in World War II. I mean, that's the closest we've come to socialism. You had an Office of Price Administration. You had a War Production Board. But during peacetime, you're always prepared for war, and you do that through government. Government needs to reallocate some resources, but the market system, which exists under capitalism, is an extraordinarily effective way, and has proven it, of using resources, human and other kinds, to produce incredible goods. And Henry Ford could devise a system that could turn out a couple million cars a year, but he could only use half a dozen himself, or his whole family could use 50. I mean, he had to turn out a couple million cars that other people got to use, and that would not have, in my view, I think if you'd set up a government bureau in 1850 and given them 100 years to develop a car, I'm not so sure that you'd have ever come up with anything like the assembly lines of Ford and all of the things that have happened. Human ingenuity is incredible, and you want something that maximizes its use and then curbs a few of the ideas that some of those people may have to sort of have it fall for themselves.
Charlie, you've made the same point.
The great proof of how capitalism works is China. When China copied Singapore, and let the farmers own their own plots and let the manufacturers own their own businesses and so forth. China's productivity increased many times, and they went from rural poverty to modern extreme wealth, and they did it by adopting a fair amount of capitalism. Now, if a Democratic politician doesn't understand that, he's nuts.
You've made the same point, though, Charlie, that you think private sector does it much better than the government sector. However, a lot of these people who are running also want to make government much bigger. Do you have a quarrel with that or no?
Well, as they say, if you love your post office, you're going to love socialized medicine.
Yeah, and they don't necessarily want to make it bigger in terms of redistributing. They may want to. The market system is brutal, and it leaves behind people who are perfectly wonderful people who don't have market-related talents. And
Or who are just unlucky.
yeah, just plain unlucky. And in a rich society, believe me, if we have a war or something like that, we call on those people and pay them practically nothing to go fight for us. And we want goods flowing, but it's going to displace the textile worker that we used to have and so on. So the function of government is not necessarily to get bigger. It may be in an important way to take care of people who, for one reason or another, get left behind in a market system that you also regard as essentially this huge source of wealth and goods and services. So
how do you fix the problems, or at least the perception of problems, which there's a huge perception out there in the American voting right now?
Obviously, it would help if our government were wiser. And it would be wiser if the two sides didn't hate each other so much. Anger drives out reason. And there's absolute cold fury between politicians on one side and politicians on the other. It's quite counterproductive. For that reason, I don't allow myself to get angry at politicians.
How would you fix it?
Well, I just don't let myself get that angry at politicians. I don't expect them to be
Berkshire
perfect.
has worked better because Charlie and I have never been mad at each other.
Yeah.
It just does. I mean, way better. If we got mad at each other, I'd try and kill his deals. He'd try and kill my deals. All that. It just doesn't work that way.
We don't need a couple of alpha males blustering at one another over this stuff. They ought to just cool it and take a little reputational hit and get the feathers ruffled down.
We ought to worry about the people that don't fit into the system. We want the system. And a lot of people are getting left further and further behind because as capitalism gets more advanced, it gets more specialized, and there actually is greater difference between the haves and the have-nots. And the haves can take care of the have-nots. And the interesting thing is both parties basically agree on that. They just...
Yes, how you get there, that gets complicated.
Income tax credit can make a huge jump in that direction. I mean, Social Security... we've done various things. Over the years, we have improved. We've improved the public school systems. We've improved things that do give people more of an equal chance and take care of people who fall by the wayside. We just got to keep doing it.
Bill, you've spent a lot of time on education in this country, trying to figure out how to fix it and how to make things work. What's the answer? If that's one of the problems, that we're not getting people the advantages they need before they get into that system, how do we fix that aspect of it?
Yeah, I think better education is so key to the United States living up to the dream of equal opportunity. And particularly as more and more of our students are in the inner city, coming from low-income households, we really have to take the best teachers, understand what they do, and spread that further. That is the best path to a stronger form of equality. The progress has been pretty modest, but there's a lot of smart people. It's not just technology. It's helping the teachers, finding out the ones who are doing things super well and spreading that around. Even the college system, we still have very high dropout levels, and the way you catch kids early when they get off track, some use of online. I'm hopeful in the education area, although progress has been slow.
Surprisingly slow?
Yes. When we compare the improvements in global health, which is the other big area for the Gates Foundation, to the improvement in education. Education's proven to be tougher to make big gains over the last decade.
Was that what you expected when you got started?
No, it's actually the opposite. Because global health involved going out to poor countries whose governments are really weak, and there's not even stability, there's some corruption. We thought that would be the slow area to work in, but very important. That we've been surprised by how much progress there have been in the overall statistics, like cutting child death in half. In education, although there's some points of light, some great schools, some are charter schools, some are using new curriculum, the overall figures, U.S. math scores, dropout rates, have moved only slightly.
Charlie, just getting back to your idea of people not hating each other so much and getting along, how do we make that happen? How do you try and push towards that? Because it seems like things have gotten
Well, I
worse.
think you have to do it one relationship at a time. And of course, I think it would help if both parties did not commit suicide in the primaries. If we get these extremists on both sides and they take over each party, it's just awful. The California legislature has two kinds of people, rightist nutcakes and leftist nutcakes. They've kicked everybody else out. This is not a good system.
Why did it wind up like that, particularly in California?
Hatred. Lots of hatred.
Is it redistricting? I mean, how would you?
There was redistricting as part of it, but mostly it's just the wonderful product of hatred.
Gentlemen, just taking a look at what we've been watching with the markets today. Obviously, things are under a little bit of pressure today, but we have been looking at much higher markets if you go back to the Christmas Eve low and the concern about what the Fed might or might not be doing. Since that time, the Fed has sounded much more dovish. And I just wonder if you could talk a little bit about your own take on the markets. And Bill, again, I've spoken with Warren and Charlie earlier about this a little bit. So how about your take? When you hear that the Federal Reserve is probably not going to be raising interest rates anytime soon, how does that change your outlook on equities or equities versus treasuries?
Well, the interest rate is like gravity, and all these valuations are dramatically affected by it. At the start of the year, people didn't think the 10-year bond would be where it is today, and that's provided a lot of lift. So it was a big first quarter for U.S. equities. We still, if you look forward, are at these very high valuation levels. And so it's hard to see that the market will be gaining a lot over the next few years. I think people should have fairly modest expectations on what their portfolios will make in the years in front of us.
Have you changed your positions in your own portfolio as a result of this? Have you done any major?
No, it's a very equity-oriented portfolio. It's overweight in the U.S., even though it's got a lot of overseas exposure. It's a bullish portfolio that the American economy over time will do well. Fortunately, even if we have a few years here where markets are doing that well, we've been lucky. We have a cushion. The foundation continue to spend generously. Mm-hmm. But I'm amazed at how high the valuations are if you look broadly.
Charlie, do you think that?
Well, sure. I think that if you drive interest rates down to zero and all the countries print money like crazy, it's lifted the asset boat for everybody. And I think it really is. They didn't have anything else to do in the Great Recession. And so they took the only weapon they had and used it aggressively. I don't think we should quarrel with that. It did cause the people who were already rich to get richer. But that wasn't done on purpose or anything like that. And I think that will correct automatically.
Do you think we should still be using that weapon aggressively, which is what President Trump would like to see happen? He wants them to cut interest rates again, I think he said by 1%, and also push up quantitative easing once again. Build up the
I am
balance sheet.
so afraid of a democracy getting the idea that you can just print money to solve all problems. And eventually, I know that will fail. Singapore, which has a marvelous economy, has zero debt. If I were running the world, I would like the United States to be in that position. That is not the typical, that's nobody's position. No, all these politicians in Europe and America have learned to print money.
And if we keep at these extraordinary measures for the Fed, I guess not just the Fed here, but central banks around the globe.
Yes, but who knows when money printing runs out of control? And at the end, if you print too much, you end up in something like Venezuela.
You're not suggesting that happens anytime
No,
soon.
but I don't like the idea. And both parties, you get politicians say, what we learned is we can print all the money we want.
Right.
We don't have to raise taxes, we just print.
Warren, you share those concerns?
Yeah, I probably could not have conceived of a world as recently as 10 years ago. I would not have conceived of a world where you would have full employment, 5% budget deficits, with actually the probability of those rising from that level, and at the same time have the long bond at 3%. I would have said that couldn't happen. And then people now, you have this modern monetary theory, which there's no question you should borrow, any country should borrow money in its own currency. I mean, that is not like it's some great discovery or something that's been announced, but
No, but it can be overdone.
yeah, and that's the point. I mean, that hasn't solved anything. Just to say, well, it's much safer to borrow money in your own currency, but the convergence of these factors would have seemed impossible to me, and generally, if I feel something is impossible, it's going to change over time. I don't know in what way, but I don't think we can continue to have these variables in this relationship. Now, if we can, then stocks are ridiculously cheap.
The one thing I will say, though, is this is a conversation I feel like we've had for at least 4 or 5 years.
Right.
Where you're watching and continuing to wait for these interest rates, the yields to rise. We're still sitting at 2.5% on the 10-year, which is shocking.
Yeah, and we're sitting with very, very little inflation with a Federal Reserve that put a target for 2% on it not that long ago. And it looks like nirvana. It looks like we found the promised land where we just essentially money doesn't cost anything, and you can print lots of money and have full employment and no inflation. And I would have thought that something would have happened before now. I don't know what would have happened, but I wouldn't think you could have these things at these levels, the long-term rates, inflation rates, budget deficits, and have that be a stable situation for a long period of time. And I still believe that, but so far I'm wrong.
So in the meantime, you haven't really changed how you...
No, I think stocks are ridiculously cheap compared, if you believe that you're going to have the 3% interest, 30-year bonds makes sense.
That's a big if, though.
That's what makes going to work interesting.
Well, this threesome is comfortable if everything goes down by 90%. So we're not a fair cross-section.
I'm sorry, Charlie, what was that?
I say this threesome is comfortable if everything goes down by 90%. It doesn't
stock
really
prices,
hurt us.
equities know the rest.
Yeah, but we wouldn't want that kind of a world happening to everybody else.
Right. Can we talk a little bit about healthcare? Because you all have spent plenty of time focusing on healthcare in the United States and abroad. Bill, you're probably the foremost authority on global healthcare. Your foundation has spent billions and billions of dollars on it. I think more than $13 billion just from inception through 2017 on global healthcare initiatives. What's the progress? You touched on it a little bit earlier, that you've seen more progress here than in the education front in the United States. How's that kind of shown up?
Well, it's phenomenal that by taking the new vaccines and getting them out to more kids and a few other tools like malaria bed nets, that we've gone from over 10 million children dying every year to now less than 5 million. Now 5 million is still a lot. We need a few more tools, but actually the pipeline of innovation looks very good. This is a phenomenally positive story that those deaths are way down, and that'll continue.
What's the thing that brings you the most hope or gives you the most hope about advancements that you've made or research that you've found?
Well, one that we're working on is to reduce malnutrition, because if a kid is growing well, their ability not only to avoid these diseases like diarrhea killing them, but also the degree to which they'll develop their full mental and physical capacities and therefore contribute for their own life, for their country's well-being. Dramatic reduction in malnutrition would be a huge thing, and we're now gaining understanding that we think that will be possible. It's been a long scientific journey having to do with the gut and inflammation and the microbiome, but now we see that we'll get more of those kids on their growth path. And so I'm super excited about that.
But malnutrition is not just them not having the food to eat. Even in cases where they do have the food to eat, there's a problem.
That's right. What happens is that because their diet doesn't have much protein in it, their gut, their intestines get into an inflamed state. And that means you get a set of bacteria in there that don't let them absorb nutrition. And so that's a downward path. And so you can see even two twins, one will get that and not be growing, and the other one will achieve normal growth. And so an intervention that stops the inflammation, shifts the microbiome to a more healthy mix, that would get rid of malnutrition for that child. So what is a really cheap intervention where you can see the problem and stop it?
With probiotics or something?
Yes, that's the kind of thing. Although those tend to be broad spectrum, here we're going to be, to make it, scale it up and have it be a cheap, probably a pill. It'll probably be a couple of vitamins and drugs.
Does that translate to things that could be useful here in the United States and other developed
Well, the
nations?
basic understanding of your gut and will finally lead us to understand not just malnutrition, but overnutrition. Why is it so hard to control people's hunger? Over time, people have tried to have pills to control hunger. I'd say over the next decade, that will finally succeed. So even though that's not the foundation side, we're focused on malnutrition. The science of the gut and the microbiome has a lot of companies working on things that will reduce overnutrition.
Warren, back here in the United States, one of the big problems is trying to figure out how to pay for healthcare and stop some of the costs. That's a problem you've been focused on at Berkshire, along with JP Morgan and Amazon. What have you found? We haven't gotten any updates recently other than the name of this new organization is going to be Haven. Where are you on that process?
Well, we are taking the first step on what is bound to be a very long journey. I mean, I would say it's not more difficult than I expected, but I expected it to be ungodly difficult. And you have an industry which basically is about the same size as the U.S. government's receipts. And everybody always says every dollar in the budget, has a constituency, and every dollar in an industry expenditure has a constituency. And we've got the right person, we've got the right partners. Capital isn't the key part to it, but we've got people who are willing to spend the money. But we'll spend whatever money it takes if we're making progress. And it is going to be a long, tough pull to make major journey to make major changes. And there's, it has no guarantee of success or at all. But there's nobody, I think, that's in a better position in terms of number of employees and the ability of the people that are partnering to get along and all kinds of things, to perhaps come up with something that makes the system more efficient. And we'll try, but it's nothing will happen quicker soon. There's no revolutionary move or anything of the sort, and there will be lots of opposition to any change. In interviewing people to run the place, we interview people in all aspects of the medical profession and or activity, and they all agreed 100%. This system needs change, but of course not my part, and that's very understandable. We expect that, and we'll find out what happens. But I know this: I would rather have the private sector come up with a solution than throw it all to government. And if the private sector doesn't come up with some solution to the increase in cost, the quality is, in many ways, it's unbelievable. You're just hearing Bill talk about the advances that can be made. But the cost 5% of GDP in my lifetime, or even my adulthood, up to 18%. Right. The federal budget has stayed kind of constant around 17%. Everybody thinks it's out of control and all these terrible things. And here, federal receipts, I should say. And now this has gone from 5 to 18, and nobody really thinks it's going to stop.
Charlie, you've been, go ahead. You've been at Good Samaritan, the chairman there, for how many years?
Long for 40 years. If you take Singapore, which tends to have an intelligent government and do things right, they spend about 20% of what we spend on health care, and they're healthier. And there are all kinds of abuse and counterproductive activity they don't have in Singapore that we do have. And Warren is right. We're going to have a hell of a time getting in Singapore's direction because human beings are profiting over the existing system.
Right.
It may look like an unnecessary operation to me. In fact, it does. But to them, it looks like God's work.
Where would you suggest, after your years at Good Samaritan, where would you say focus here first?
I think this system is out of control. The deductibles in ordinary corporate health insurance are ridiculous. Mm-hmm. If you're a poor family and you get a $5,000 bill for a baby, that you don't have medical insurance. They just changed the system. And then if you take the utterly unnecessary treatment where people find a way to tap into these government streams of money and do a lot of unnecessary work like prolonging inevitable death and all kinds of ghastly things they do. I would say we have a pretty disgusting system. On the other hand, it's the best in the world in terms of its ultimate scientific capacity. Mm-hmm. But if you take all the unnecessary operations and all the unnecessary procedures and all the rackets in the thing, which Singapore is pretty well taken out, it's discouraging. As I look at Singapore, I look at the United States and think, how in the hell do we get from where we are to there? Right. And if you ask me what's going to happen, I think we're going to fail to get to an intelligence system.
Well, on that cheery note, we are just about out of time. If I can ask you, gentlemen, we have about a minute left. If I can just ask you what you're reading, because that's something we hear back from our viewers often. Warren, what are you reading right now?
I've just finished reading very recently, and I read it in one sitting. It captivated me so much. A book by Melinda Gates, which just came out very recently, and
it's a bestseller.
The Moment of Bliss. It is a terrific. It's a story but it's learned much about the world that you should know, and I would say most people don't know. I mean, this is a story of her experiences. It's absolutely sensational.
Warren took all your time. Bill, I guess you're not upset about that.
I love the book.